I had been raised Eastern Orthodox, but of course religion was forbidden under communism. And I also had very little respect for the institution of the church and the way it was presenting itself in the context of communism. And so I was always convinced in the source of wisdom and a power that exists in the universe, but I had no concept beyond that of any kind. And so I saw this woman, and she was radiating light, and she led us into this beautiful Persian living room. We sat down, everybody was already there in a circle, and the conversation was going. And at the center was this dignified Nigerian woman in African headdress. And she was speaking about the atrocities to which girls were subjected if they were in any way disobedient to their families and their customs and their traditions at the time. And I remember sitting and listening and just admiring the composure and the serenity of this Nigerian woman and wondering why she was not angry. But then Nuri began to speak, and she began to describe her necessity to flee from Tehran with only the clothes on her back and her 11-year-old son in her hand in hand, across the desert. And she described how they had to pay to people to lead them through the desert. And she described the condition of women at the time and her own conditions in Iran, and how she had served as the assistant of the chair of the Iranian NSA committee at the time that was taking care of the Iranian Friends. This lady, whose name was Dr. Jinous Mahmoudi, had called Nuri and had told her that she needs to leave immediately. She had been able to realize that they were coming after her that night. And Nuri knew everything that the committee was doing to assist financially Iranian Baha'i professors who had been fired from their positions, and the NSA committee was, in whatever meager ways they could, was trying to support them and their families until they could find a footing. And Nuri knew too many names and too much information, and she was warned that if she was captured, she would be tortured. And there was a great danger in terms of not being able to hold that information and putting many lives in danger. She was telling this story in her living room, and I still get chills when I think of this. But she was speaking of that with such serenity and such composure and no anger. There was no hard feelings. And I was looking at this woman, I was 32 years at the time, and just thinking, what does she know that allows her to be so composed, so radiant, so beautiful, so forgiving? What does she know? What she knows is what I need in my life. That's how I left that night. For a year, Nuri's home became my home. I was, as I said, in the process of divorcing. Life was very hard. But Nuri became my mother, my spiritual mother in every way. And she told me the stories about the Iranian Baha'is. I started to find a lot of books. Of course, there was a very strong Baha'i community in Amherst, Massachusetts, old and strong. And they were all wonderful people. So I was learning from all of them, but most of all, learning from her way of being. She had regular firesides. Her home was full of light and love, and people from everywhere kept coming. And I could just see firsthand the transforming influence of this faith on people and in my own life. I started to feel the change. The anger began to recede, the resentment about everything that I had gone through till then. They took my son, she and her husband JJ, took my son under their wings, and that their home became our shelter, our everything. It took a year for me to investigate the faith. I had to have all my questions answered because I was very fearful of anything organized. Having grown up in a dictatorship, I just could not trust anything organized easily. And so I had to become really assured that this was real and it was as pure and as consistent with the principles that it taught as I hoped it would be. And so it took me a year, and in the meantime I was teaching English writing at UMass for first-year college students, which meant it was a very labor-intensive teaching position. And I had to spend my nights reading stacks of student papers and responding in depth, and that was just one of the 3 assistantships that I held. On the night of October 9th, 1993, a Baha'i friend passed by. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. I had just put my son to bed, and he stopped by because he knew I had shared with him already that everything in the faith made a lot of sense, but I could not bring myself to pray. I had never prayed in my life. And so that was my particular barrier. So he stopped that evening at my home and he asked my permission to just share a prayer. I accepted, and he did, and he read the prayer, "Create in me a pure heart, oh my God, and renew a tranquil conscience in me, oh my hope."
Create in me a pure heart, oh my God, oh my God, and renew a tranquil conscience within me, oh my hope, through the Spirit of power, confirm thou me in thy cause, oh my best beloved.
I listened to it, and it just really took my breath away. So he left, and I sat back in front of my computer in a niche in a small student apartment with bare walls. It was just the computer facing the walls and a stack of student papers waiting. That was going to take me the night to go through. And as I started to read the first paper and look into my screen to write my response, something happened. I became aware of little particles of light began to stream from the ceiling. And at first I didn't know what was happening. And then I looked up, and it was just this flood of light that descended from the ceiling. And it's something that is very hard to describe, but instantly I knew that I was in the presence of the light, that somehow this was a communication to me. And what was more important even than anything I knew was what I felt. I felt this extraordinary joy. I felt surrounded by light and love. I felt in the presence. It was an eternal moment. I do not know how long it lasted, but I remember to this day, probably will till I pass on, how the light began to gradually lift and sort of disappear into the ceiling. And I don't know how long that lasted for. It could have been a minute or two, but it felt eternal. And I was just so happy. I was in ecstasy. There was no more questions in my mind. All the barriers had lifted. And so the rest of that night, I could not sleep. To my amazement, I have no memory how I went through the papers. They took no time at all, probably no more than 2 hours. But then the rest of the night, I kept reading that prayer and eventually learned it by heart. I could not sleep. I've never in my life felt such happiness. The next morning, I got my son up, prepared him for school, and remember distinctly walking hand in hand with him on the road leading him to school, and from there crossing over to UMass campus, and feeling the whole time that I'm walking this high above the ground. Distinctly, I knew I was not stepping on the ground. I left him and walked into my class. I had to teach my class and return the student papers. And I remember looking at the students' faces, and everybody's face looked so different. I could see so much light in every face. And I knew at that point that a whole new journey had begun in my life, that this was a new life. This was October 10th. October 9th was my son's birthday. That happened on October 10th. So that day I called Nuri and I told her I'm ready to sign my card. And she was so happy. And the following day, on October 11th, Nuri had prepared a beautiful cake and the friends from the Amherst LSA had gathered. And they all were there with joy, and I had the opportunity to sign my card and declare my faith in Baha'u'llah. And that's really the beginning of my life. I was 33. The rest seems to be the introductory chapter. So when I declared my faith, of course I called my parents and I shared the joyful news with them. And of course at first they were a little perplexed. They did not understand what all of that meant. They were scared that this may be some kind of ideology. It took a while for me to be able to see them and explain to them what this is, and that really this is the embodiment of everything that they ever taught me, and that this really is the message of God for this day. My mother asked me, does that mean that you have turned your back on Christ? Because Christ mattered in her life. The figure of Christ was very important in her life. And I explained to her, no, it actually means that I am fulfilling the mandate of Christ, because this is the return of Christ in this day. And when you read his teachings, you will know that in your heart. So she did. She began to read the teachings. She started to visit us. My father visited us. They came to Baha'i gatherings. My mother regularly, daily says her Baha'i prayers now. And even though neither one of them has formally declared, they are both deeply respectful of the faith, and my mother has taken great lengths to really understand the teachings. I was actually doing my doctorate in human growth and development, and my specialty was in adult development. And if I could just step back a year earlier, when I first heard about the faith in '92 and began to read, I was amazed, because at the time I was studying in my doctoral program the most advanced theories of adult development, which were truly fascinating for me and answered many of my questions about how and why we betray ourselves, which is why I had gone to the US. That was the purpose of my research, the purpose of my dissertation. The one question I wanted to understand about human motivation is why we betray ourselves and therefore betray each other as well. And so I was studying that when I began to discover the writings. And I could not understand, these writings were so developmental, had such a macro developmental perspective, and yet none of that was in any way mentioned in my program. And I could not understand how we can do such sophisticated individual adult development in the lifespan and not have the macro developmental perspective that I was discovering in the faith. And so instantly from 1992, I began to bring everything that I was discovering in the writings into my formal program of study. When it came time to form my committee, my dissertation committee, I let them know that in my study of critical consciousness, I will have to draw on the writings as well as everything in psychology, because they speak to psychological and sociological knowledge in a way that I haven't found anywhere else, and that these sources have to be used as legitimate sources to be investigated. Well, that, of course, was a very serious problem, and it had to be extensively negotiated, and it was an issue to the end, to my dissertation defense. But I did persist, and in fact, the dissertation defense in 1996 opened up with Baha'u'llah's second hidden word: the most beloved of all things in my sight is justice. And I told my dissertation committee that after so many years of doing research into what makes some people have the courage and the motivation to stay true to what is just and right, and for so many others to compromise and really to betray what they know in their hearts, had in fact been answered long before me by Baha'u'llah. I just did not know it. 3 months after I declared my faith, I met my present husband, Rosie's father, Earl, and I knew the day that I met him. It was very, very strange. When I met him, there was just this inner knowing that happened within me, that this is the person with whom I would have to traverse Baha'u'llah's next spiral for me. It was very mystical, I cannot explain it, but I just knew. It was not a matter of love, it was a matter of knowing that this is the person and I am supposed to journey with him, and that there's a real spiral ahead. He was not a Baha'i, and we had a blended family. He had his daughter and I had my son. 2 cultures, very different, and lots of complexities in graduate school and in a blended family. But anyways, this is what the faith encourages us to do, and I learned really a great deal through this journey. It doesn't matter our past. If our heart is searching, the answer will come to you like a breeze.